Chapter 15, Biological Resources. Now that we talked about a little bit about ecology and ecosystems and the importance of the energy and the materials that are part of those ecosystems and how all living things rely on them, let's talk about in this chapter what happens when we lose some of those members of a species or of a population or even of a community. So we're going to talk about the importance of all of these living things, and we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We'll talk about this concept called biological diversity. We'll talk about endangered and extinct species, and we'll talk a little bit about what we can do in terms of trying to save those species, conservation biology, and conservation policies and laws. So we kind of talked about populations before, but we didn't really define a species. So we talked about a population as being a group of individuals of a species living in the same area at the same time. Well, what's a species? A species is a group of distinct organisms that are only capable of breeding with each other, but they wouldn't breed with anyone outside of their group. So when we say breeding, we mean not only the successful ability to mate, but also to produce fertile offspring. So that's kind of the requirement that we have. To be a species, you can only mate with the others in your group and nobody else, and create those fertile offspring that then can have their own offspring. How many species do we have here on the planet? That's a really good question. Scientists aren't really sure. We can go all the way from the low end of saying there's about 5 million species on the planet, all the way up to some believe there's 100 million species on the planet. We identify approximately 10,000 new species per year. Most of these are things that will go relatively unnoticed. A lot of insect diversity, lots of different insects, a lot of plant diversity, things that people might not notice as much as something a little bit bigger and flashier, like a new bird or a new mammal, for example. So why is it so important that we have all of these species? Well, collectively, we call all of the variety of things living on this planet, we call it biodiversity. And biodiversity contains 3 important parts. It's genetic diversity, so the number of different genes that we have in each species. It's the species richness, the number of species on the planet, and also ecosystem diversity, so the number of different types of ecosystems. All of that together creates what we term this idea of biodiversity. And biodiversity is essentially what enables us to survive on this planet. So very early on at the beginning of the semester, we talked about how humans are dependent on our environment for survival. Well, to make that a little bit more clear, humans are dependent on biodiversity for our survival. It does a whole host of things for us that we don't even think about. We need insects and birds and things for pollination in order to have the fruits that we like to eat. They're used for weed controls and pest control. We use bacteria and fungi for things like food, antibiotics, and medicine. What's interesting is not that we have as many different species as we have that we rely on for our survival, but what's even more interesting is that all of the species that are out there that we don't know what we could possibly use them for someday. So there's over 250,000 species of plants that are just out there that may very well be useful to us. They could cure cancer. They could be the next great source for a biofuel, for a renewable energy source. We just don't know. So as exciting as it is that we have all of this wonderful biodiversity that provides for us as humans, it's even more exciting that there's so much more out there to be discovered. So when we talk about the importance of biodiversity, one of the things we talk about are ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are benefits that ecosystems provide for us just by being there. So things like cleaning the air. Plants are great at pulling out actually toxins out of the air, and they internalize those, and then they provide us with a nice fresh oxygen for us to breathe. Clean water, fertile soils, all of these types of things, flood control, all of these are provided by ecosystems just because they're there. There's nothing particularly special about the services they're providing other than as long as you let that ecosystem stay intact, as long as it's functioning, then it'll provide that service for you indefinitely. The problem is once you mess with an ecosystem, you remove a species, you add a species, you do something to tinker around with it, that ecosystem may no longer provide those benefits that we rely on. So here's a nice little table that talks about different types of ecosystems and the services they provide. And again, lots of things like purifying air and water, removing pollutants, absorbing carbon. All of these are, again, important things that as long as these systems are left intact and allowed to function, they'll provide these services for us indefinitely. Not only do we have the services the ecosystems themselves provide, but also the organisms that live there. We have medicinal, agricultural, and industrial importance of a whole host of things. You can look at drugs. You can look at the food that we eat, the plants that we eat to survive. You can even look at the industrial technology. We use oils and lubricants and perfumes and dyes and a whole host of other different things that come directly from other organisms in order to make our lives better. And then there's those who would just argue that diversity is valuable simply because it's there, not because it's useful, not because it provides anything, but simply because there's an ethical, aesthetic, spiritual value, if you want to call it that. It's the beauty of the diversity of living things on their own. We like nature. Nature is nice. We like to go out and we like to enjoy nature. And our lives wouldn't be as full or as complete if it wasn't there anymore. So what happens when we talk about the removal of a species? Well, if the species is completely eliminated from the earth, we call it extinction. Extinction is a natural part of life. There's two types of extinction, what we call the background extinction rate and mass extinction events. Background extinction is a very continuous, low level of extinction of species. There's about one species per million, that goes extinct every year. So if there's 5 million species on this earth, we would expect 5 or so to disappear every year. If there's 100 million species on this earth, we would expect about 100 of those to disappear every year. Mass extinction events are those where we have large numbers of species disappearing during a relatively short period of time. So we'll have hundreds of species lost, in some cases thousands of species lost. There have been several great mass extinctions within the course of the Earth's history. The extinction of the dinosaurs counts as one of the great mass extinctions. So we've seen these before. What's interesting is that a lot of scientists believe we are in the midst of a great mass extinction right now because humans are causing species to go extinct at about 100 to 1,000 times the natural rate of background extinction. So rather than making 5 species go extinct every year, we're seeing 500 or 5,000. It depends on, again, how many species you think are on the planet. So we have a whole host of species that, again, are either completely extinct or those who are on their way to extinction. And those are called endangered and threatened species. That's our next big point. The difference between endangered and threatened is an endangered species is in imminent danger of extinction throughout everywhere it lives or most everywhere it lives. It's in a lot of trouble. Threatened species are those whose populations have declined, that if they continue to decline, they're going to be at a risk of extinction. So of the two, being endangered is the more prominent label. It's the one that's you're most in jeopardy if you are endangered. Threatened, you're not quite as in danger, but you're getting there. So there are certain places in the world where we see declining biological diversity. And some of these places are here in the United States, mostly in Hawaii and California. In Hawaii alone, 63% of species are at risk. 2/3 of the native forests of Hawaii are gone. And in California, almost 30% of species are at risk. In tropical rainforests, there's a very serious concern of extinction because we have these rainforests that are being removed in order for human settlement, to make plantations, to mine oil, to mine minerals. They're home to a huge, vast number of species that are found nowhere else on this planet. They're what we call endemic. So what scientists have done is they have created a map which lists places that we are most concerned about and we want to try to protect the most. These are places where we call them biodiversity hotspots. They contain almost 30% of the world's endemic species. Remember, endemic means found nowhere else. 30% of the mammals, 38% of reptiles, 53% of those being amphibian species that you can't find anywhere else on the planet. They're also home to 20% of the world's human population. So this map represents those hot spots. These are places where we could do the most good by protecting as much of these areas as possible. And again, here's the part in the United States, again, Caribbean, Central and South America, even to parts of Asia. So parts of Africa. There are places that we really need to do something. So what do humans do to cause species to go extinct? Loss of habitat is the very greatest threat, but we also create pollution, we spread invasive species, and we overexploit things. And all of this is caused by human populations. We break we break habitats up into fragments. We make it so that species can no longer survive. We create pollution, which we've already talked about in other chapters. I want to spend a little time talking about invasive species and what invasive species are very quickly. So invasive species, and here's a nice little graphic showing you several different invasive species. These are plants, animals, insects, anything, introduced into an area either accidentally or intentionally. And they don't belong here. So what happens is that they typically start to do damage in their new home, in their new environment. They're very difficult to control because they left their old ecosystem and they're being thrown into a new one. And they might not have the same predators. They might not have the same diseases that kept their numbers intact in their previous ecosystem. In this new ecosystem, it's like a whole new open world that they can explore. Zebra mussels are a great example of this. These things are in Lake Michigan. They've been horribly damaging for ships, for pipelines coming in and out of the lake. They clog them up. They've been a huge headache. At this point, there's really no way to get rid of zebra mussels. We just kind of have to live with them. Overexploitation. They get hunted, they get poached, they get trapped. What do we do about this? That's where conservation biology comes in. And basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what we can do to save species, to protect places. We can start by protecting habitats and conserving open space. Creating national parks and preserves and all of those things are a really good step at protecting species. We can restore damaged or destroyed habitats. It's called restoration ecology. We can take something that used to be an intact ecosystem, it was converted into something else like a farm, and then we replace it and we turn it back into the grassland that it once was. We can also work to just conserve species themselves. And this is what a lot of zoos and aquaria and botanical gardens are actually doing. So we can reintroduce endangered species through captive breeding programs. For plants, we can save seeds so that we can make sure that we have seeds that we can replant if they ever go extinct in the wild. And all of these things, again, are efforts to maintain the diversity that we have. Very briefly, I'm going to quickly talk about the Endangered Species Act, and then we're going to end this particular lecture. So the biggest conservation policy here in the United States is the Endangered Species Act. We have about 1,300 species that are listed, and what happens is when a species is listed, we have to maintain and create critical habitat for their recovery is what happens. It's a relatively controversial law simply because if you have endangered habitat that's on your property that is used by endangered species, you can no longer use your property how you want. You basically have to let the government have control over it so that they can restore these species. There are some international policies as well, including CITES, that I encourage you to look over. But that does it for this lecture. Please make sure you review the rest of my notes.